Hi everyone. All right, so we are recording the second part of our uh, section on Kant, um, reading from Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, the section, the Transcendental Aesthetic, part two of the Transcendental Aesthetic, which is on time. And as we saw in the last video, uh, Kant is making the argument for uh, subjectivism, for the idea that our experience of space and time are uh, part of the form of our subjectivity and not things that exist independently of the human subject. That space and time are conditions for the possibility of experience of the external world and not part of the external world itself. So we said just briefly in our last video that the Transcendental Aesthetic is divided into these two sections, one on space, the second on time, and that space is the form of outer intuition, that space as extension is the condition for the possibility of any outer experience, and that time is the corresponding form of inner intuition, by which we intuit our inner experience, intuit ourselves, as Kant says. And so let's jump into the text a little bit here. But let's begin with just a brief word about what time is, how we think about time, the tradition that Kant is responding to, and its concept of time, where time is understood primarily in terms of two ideas: succession, or a series of events, and simultaneity. What are the modes of temporality, things happening in succession in time or simultaneously in time? And Kant wants to argue that when we think about time, all we really need to think about is succession. That the essence of time, our concept of time, our representation of time, is time as succession, a succession of events. We think of this as a timeline, right? Where time is conceived as a series of moments. Often this is talked about in terms of T1, T2, T3, and onward, right? So T1 is moment 1, which is succeeded by T2, so a time series. Right? Now, this problem of time as succession is part of what motivates Kant's project to begin with. And the risk of falling down a rabbit hole, I'll say that we mentioned David Hume's problem of causation, which set Kant to work on his critique of pure reason. Right? The problem of causation is twofold. I mentioned, I think I went into depth only about the first part, and that is Hume's observation that causation is not an empirical concept, right? That although we organize the empirical world, the world that we experience, around the idea of cause and effect, causation or causality, that we never actually have a sensory impression of a cause. Causation itself is not part of what we receive through our senses. The second part of this problem of causation, and this is really the thornier, more profound argument against causation, is connected to this problem of time as succession. And Hume will say the problem with the theory of causation, the idea of causation, is that we have to, in a theory of causation, posit two contradictory things. First, we have to posit that time is necessarily succession, right? That A causes B. Causation requires that time be successive. It requires succession of events, right? Effect follows cause, cause produces effect. These are two successive moments necessarily. So causation requires succession, time is succession, and yet there is then this problem that we've talked about before with Aristotle, I'm thinking of in particular, but also with Descartes, which is the problem of the first cause. Now, the first cause is not going to be a cause that happens as succession, where effect follows cause. The first cause must be cause and effect simultaneously, right? To be self-caused, as Aristotle says the prime mover is, and as right, God is generally understood to be. To be self-caused means to be simultaneously cause and effect. Right? So it is to collapse the succession that causality seems to require. So this is one of these contradictions or paradoxes of causation, that causation is understood necessarily in terms of succession, cause and then effect, and yet in order for causation to come into existence, it also must assume the simultaneity of cause and effect, that cause and effect in the first cause would be simultaneous. Now, if that first cause is simultaneously its effect, then there is no chain of causes, right? Because cause and effect are one thing unified. There is no further effect from that first cause. So succession then falls apart. And this is why you could have someone like Leibniz say, and it's too bad we didn't get to talk about Spinoza, because this is really Spinoza's idea also, that the world is not in fact successive, but is a single moment. That there is no cause and effect as we think about it. There is no succession as we think about it, but instead everything exists simultaneously, right? And it's just our perspective that makes it appear to be succession. Now, there's lots and lots more we could say about the problem of causation and Hume and Leibniz and this problem, but suffice it to say for now that this leads Kant to believe that causation then is not something, again, that exists in the external world, but is an a priori idea, an innate idea that we use to organize our experience, a condition for the possibility of our experience, and that therefore we can't talk about a first cause of being as an absolute objective thing that exists independently of our minds. And therefore, we can get rid of the problem of simultaneity in time, where we would have to imagine cause and effect existing somehow simultaneously, and we can think of time as just succession. Simultaneity is for space, right? Things exist simultaneously in space, but things only exist successively in time. All right, so that's a little bit of an introductory tangent, but that is the sort of problem that Kant is addressing here, one of the main problems. So he needs to show that time is only succession, that time is inner intuition, and that time is right, not something that exists outside of ourselves. So it begins on 178. Time is not an empirical concept that is somehow drawn from an experience. Right? Not an empirical concept that is drawn from experience. I never have an experience of time that I then develop a concept based on that experience. So he says, he's arguing that simultaneity or succession, but primarily succession, would not themselves come into perception if the representation of time did not ground them a priori. That's a direct quote, right? Simultaneity or succession would not themselves come into perception if the representation of time did not ground them a priori. Now, this is a very complicated idea that Kant is working with here, and in particular, what he means by representation is interesting, right? So there must be an a priori representation of time that grounds the perception of succession. In other words, the fact that we are able to perceive things as occurring in succession in time, the fact that we perceive things in time, is grounded in an a priori representation of time. Right? This, I think, idea of representation here, this representation of time, is an intuitive form of sensibility that allows receptivity. Right? A representation is